Hello everyone, welcome to tonight's meeting of the Hand-Eye Supply Curiosity Club. We're your hosts this evening. I'm Tobias and this is Will. Together we have a number of curious and exciting topics to share with you.
As attendees of the Hand-Eye Supply Curiosity Club, you're all now members, provided you adhere to our philosophy. Ex Curiositas Scientia. We pledge to learn without prejudice in pursuit of our mutual goal, perpetual noviceship. We admit that it is impossible to know everything about anything, and thus we remain perpetually curious and perpetually novice.
This is our flag and our mascot, Franklin. The lightning bolt represents the receipt of knowledge, the enlightenment of illumination, the resonance of truths understood. It awakens and excites us and makes us hungry for more. Curiosity Club is made merrier by our fellow artisans at Fort George Brewery in Astoria, Oregon. And now let's give a warm Curiosity Club welcome to our esteemed alumni, Amber Case.
Hello everyone, welcome. Can all of you hear me from where you're sitting? Okay, I'll try to keep this volume the entire time. I want to point out that there are 2 seats up here and 1 seat up here. So if I start mumbling or you want to be closer, then feel free. If not, and you're too fearful to sit this close, don't sit this close, and that's fine, stay where you are. So my name is Amber Case. I presented here a few times ago, and today I'd like to talk to you about calm technology. So the quote that I usually begin with is this quote that many of you have probably seen, that 50 billion devices are going to be online by 2020. People are usually really excited about this quote at conferences. They say, there's going to be this utopia in which we've figured everything out. And of course, 50 years ago, people said the same thing, and again, and again, and again. The truth is that nature and reality is really messy. We haven't figured everything out. And right now, our technology isn't really that calm. And it's going to get worse when we do have 50 billion devices out there. So I like to ask the opposite of what people are usually saying. Okay, does this sound good? Well, let's consider some different alternatives to what might happen. You could have smartwatches or smartwatch knockoffs that are constantly beeping you about various things that you don't really care about, taking you out of reality instead of keeping you inside reality. You could have companies that make proprietary smart fridges that don't work with any of the other technology in your house and maybe lock you out when you've eaten too many calories, except if your diabetic friend comes over and you need to actually get into the fridge and feed them some food. But when you have all these different companies with different types of protocols and people writing in different programming languages and executives deciding the features instead of the actual developers, you get what I call the dystopian kitchen of the future. The dystopian kitchen of the future is not something that you have now, it's something that you inherit when you buy a house 10 years from now, where some weird person decided that they would embed all of this smart technology into their house so that when they got home, they could be more like a system administrator instead of an actual person relaxing at home. And in this dystopian kitchen of the future, everything beeps at you. Bananas tell you when they're not ripe anymore, and as we all know, you don't need a banana to have a chip that tells you when it's not ripe. It actually turns a different color, and then you can tell whether it's right or wrong. But the idea behind this is that things don't speak with each other, and so you kind of get this future that kind of works and kind of doesn't. And as my friend Vin calls it, this is more of a mild dystopia. It's not dystopian enough that you get really angry, and it's not utopic. It's just kind of a mild dystopia where betwixt and between the nice moments, you have to fuddle with a bunch of remote controls and random things that tell you that you need to update your fridge's software or you can't open the door, or that there's been a virus update on your toilet and you can't go to the bathroom until you download the virus update. Now, I'm giving you lots of extreme examples, but I have been in meetings with Fortune 500 companies that talk about things like this. They talk about fridges that you have on a subscription plan, and each person gets on a subscription plan with their fridge, and it's $24.95, and then you have to have somebody come to the house to set up the next person with the subscription plan so it can track all of your stuff. So I argue that we kind of have this era of interruptive technology, and this is something that really makes us less human. Instead of just doing the things that we want to do, we end up getting interrupted a lot by every time you open up your iPhone, sorry, you haven't backed this up to the cloud storage provider that we have you pay for, because of course it's easy to store things in the cloud, access is expensive. So I think that we instead need this concept of a calm technology. Now, this concept is not new at all. In fact, I like to go digging back into the past, which is pretty recent in the mid-90s. These two guys, Mark Weiser and John Seely Brown, worked at Xerox PARC. And we know about the modern user interface, and a lot of amazing things, kind of like Ethernet and things that we use, comes out of this place. But these guys, Mark Weiser and John Seely Brown, said, one day there's going to be a world filled with pads, tabs, and boards. And when we have this world filled with these devices, the most valuable resource is going to be attention. And that's the thing that we need to look out for. So they wrote these papers. One was called The Coming Age of Calm Technology. So they talked about in the mainframe world in which we had these computers the size of gymnasiums. And then it was many people to one computer. So you rented time on this machine. Then there was the desktop computer era, where everybody had a desktop, or maybe there were 2 or 3 people in a household to a desktop. Then we have the kind of web era and the mobile era, where maybe you have 3 things per person. You have a pad, a tab, and a board, and like an iPad and a little board and things like that. And they argued that the next era is the era of devices that are hooked to these remote mainframes. Now it's many devices to one person instead of many people to one device. And they said that in this period of time, I'm gonna wait.
Good call.
In this period of time, it's really, really important to design things so that we take advantage of humanity and promote humanness instead of just technology. Now, the reason why they were able to figure out all of this was that Xerox PARC in this building not in Southern California, outside of Palo Alto, California, they were creating the future. They were making these boards where you could see everybody in the office. People wear these little active badges when they walked in, and the building itself would detect when you walked into work, and then it would say, oh, hey, you're here, and it would turn on your computer in the background, because of course computers would take like 3 or 4 minutes to boot up at that time. So by the time you got to your desk, you could see this. They also live streamed the very first band on the internet, which was Mark Weiser's band called Severe Tire Damage. Mark Weiser decided, hey, we have this really fast internet system. Let's just use it to live stream the first band on the internet. So they found this really famous band. I forgot who it was because I'm not good at famous things. But and then they got these guys to accept it. And then they said, can we open for you? And then they got the funding to do it. So this is the way that these guys kind of think, right? So they're playing around with this weird technology. There were a lot of anthropologists there. There were designers. There were weird people from all different backgrounds. And they just got to play around and design the future. And they created these papers on, here's what we figured out. Now, the thing at Xerox PARC is that everybody's writing in similar code, using similar technology, and if you have an error or a bug, you can walk down the hall and say, hey, I have a problem with this software. And in the real world, you've got 10 million people using a piece of software, and they can't just walk down the hall and tell somebody that something's failing. And you have many more edge cases in the real world. I like to tell people who are trying to make an app, can somebody download it and use it when they're in the checkout line at a grocery store? Can they do it when it's not the primary purpose? Another paper that was written by Mark Weiser was this thing called The World is Not a Desktop. He said, we cannot design technology today like we would design for a desktop, because on a desktop, you're sitting here, all of your attention is attuned to a device. And so you can make use of somebody's attention entirely. But when you have all these smart embedded devices and all these new technologies, you can't do that, because the best you're going to get is continuous partial attention, as Lisa Reichelt calls it, that we're not really attuning entirely to anything anymore. We just kind of have this fragmented attention span. And so how do we design technology that makes use of that and gives us more of our attention back? So with that, there are some principles of designing calm technology, which I'll now run through. The first one that Mark Weiser and John Seely Brown came up with was the idea that technology shouldn't be requiring all of our attention, just some of it, and only when necessary. And they gave an example of a tea kettle. So a tea kettle, you set it, you forget it, and under its own design, it will shout at you when it's ready. So your peripheral attention can understand that something's happening in the distance. You can be in a different room. You don't have to stare at it all the time in order to make sure it's done. This is a really simple, mundane, boring piece of technology, and most of technology that's really mundane and boring and calm just fades into the background. It becomes part of our daily lives. We don't notice it anymore. It just works. The second concept is that technology should be empowering your peripheral vision or your peripheral senses. So how many people have seen those Microsoft videos or any of those like new future videos where somebody's in their perfect condo it's perfectly quiet, there are no trucks driving by, and in their perfect San Francisco accent, they tell a Siri-like device exactly what they want, and Siri understands them completely. There's all these videos about like a guy waking up alone in a very small condo situation. He's, hi, I'm waking up, and then there's this computer that speaks at him and says, hello, Dave, how's it going? Blah, 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 right? That's not how people want to be woken up in the morning. So the idea behind what Mark Weiser and John Seely Brown were talking about is this kind of calm, they talked about like a calm alarm clock, for instance, where it would beep at you and wake you up differently based on how much you had on your calendar. So there'd be this really soft, nice tone if there wasn't much on your calendar. No appointments until noon, la, 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 And then if there was a lot of stuff, it's like, So this is a weather status lighting. This is just a Hue light bulb that's connected to a weather report. So what this does is just shows the color of the weather that it's going to be that day. So you walk into your living room or kitchen, and it's lit the way the weather is going to be. And so you just notice it ambiently. And then if you want more information, you can go and actually see what the weather is really going to be by looking at the iPad on the wall. So the idea is really low resolution information can be given to you here and here. High resolution information is here. So always make use of this first and then allow people to go into a narrower point of view. This is another system. There's a startup called Beeminder, and you track your progress, like stopping smoking. And if you don't stop smoking, they take your money logarithmically each time you screw up. Hence the sting of the bee. So some people track maybe 10 or 20 things in the system, and they don't want to be checking the app every single day to see if they're getting off track. So instead, you kind of have this red alert system that says, if this light is red, then you have to check the system right now. If it's yellow, you can check the system at some point during the day or in the next 2 days. If it's green, you don't have to check the system at all. So this again allows you to get low resolution peripheral attention and then high resolution attention only if you need to. This tells you when you might have to check it versus checking it all the time. The third is that technology should be amplifying the best of what technology can do and then the best of what humans can do. When technology is poorly designed and humans are not taken into account, humans end up acting like machines. You get stuck in an airport because the reader won't scan your QR code for your ticket, and you get stuck between two countries, right? Or when you're forced to wait for something, or when you're forced to speak into your phone at Siri because Siri doesn't understand what you've said because maybe you have a slightly different accent than the perfect San Francisco accent where it was designed. So when the technology is not designed for those edge cases and not designed for humans, humans act like machines. And usually that happens when people try to make technology that acts like humans. You get that uncanny valley thing. So the best thing to do is to enable the human's curative ability, right? So the idea of Google is really simple. You type in something, and it doesn't give you the result it thinks you should have. It gives you a set of results that have been filtered by what humans have also clicked on and written about and linked to. So it's not connecting you to a machine, it's using machines to help you connect to other people. And so it's allowing you as the end curator to decide what actually is the thing that you need. So it's not putting people on pause and causing them to act like machines. This is an example of sleep cycle. Does anybody use this? Yeah, okay, great. Sleep cycle is a fantastic alarm clock. You put it on, so you put your phone like underneath your pillow, turn it into airplane mode, and then it tracks your movement. And then what you can do is set an alarm, and it will wake you up in the right REM cycle so that you don't wake up really groggy. So basically it wakes you up at some point before you need to wake up, and then you can be refreshed. And then it also tells you, you can also correlate like, did I drink coffee or exercise or drink beer, and how does that affect my sleep? So you can actually see this thing that was formerly invisible and use it to make your life better and kind of have this recursive cybernetic feedback loop that improves your life over time. Here's another example of like what your sleep cycles can look like. When I get back from an international trip, my sleep cycle is just like all deep sleep and no REM sleep because I'm just trying to catch up. Fourth, technology can communicate, but you don't need to have it speak at people. So when people say, hey, let's make a piece of technology that has a human voice, let's hire a voice actor and let's have them speak, it usually ends up failing because, first off, you have to translate it to lots of different languages. There's ambiguous issues where you don't really need to have all of that complexity. All you need to do is have a low-level language where the device says beep in a positive tone or a negative tone, right? That's it. You don't really need that much. An example early on at Xerox PARC was this idea of a dangling string. This was this piece of plastic that was hung from the ceiling, and whenever somebody was doing something on the network, the string would go, it would just kind of vibrate. And so people would walk around and they'd say, hey, look, something's going on. And then they'd ask people like, hey, what are you doing on the network? So this was kind of a thing of something interesting is happening. This became the proverbial water cooler at Xerox PARC. And it was just this interesting little art experiment that Natalie Jeremijenko did. The Lumo Back Smart Posture Sensor, everybody's straightening their backs right now. This buzzes at you when it notices that you have poor posture. So instead of your mom being there and, hey, sit up straight, it will just buzz you only when you need to be notified, where the technology is there when you need it and quiet when you don't need it. It's not telling you to check your phone with a smart message that says, hey, you need to straighten your posture. It just gives you a buzz. It's the same thing as communicating without needing to speak and have a human voice. You don't have to translate this into 20 different languages. You don't need to hire a voice actor for it. It's just giving you the information, the lowest resolution information you need to get the point across. Another example is the Roomba vacuum cleaner. So the Roomba vacuum cleaner tells you when it's done cleaning by going ding, like it's really happy, it's done something. And then if it gets stuck, it goes dun dun. And then you go find it and pick it up. And it also has a redundant display that's green or orange. And the idea behind this is that the computer is not deciding something for you. When it gets stuck, you help it out. And because you as the human have control over this kind of silly creature that is in your home, kind of like a trilobite, then you're never freaking out that the technology is taking over because you're helping the technology out. The technology is a little bit lower level than something that's, eating all of the drapes, for instance. And so it will stop and then you can help it out. I already explained the status tone alarm clock by Mark Weiser. 5, technology should be considering different social norms. The issue is that a lot of people won't do their research when they design technology, and they'll say, hey, look at this new piece of technology, everyone will love it. And the problem is they don't actually consider the fact that it might freak a lot of people out. They don't have little features that slowly go into the populace over time and allow people to become okay with it. So let's take some different examples. So there's this kind of norm line here. What everybody understands. The normal line is we all have smartphones right now. 10 years ago, we didn't all have smartphones. And so when the smartphone arrived on the scene, people got really upset. They said, oh no, there are cameras, cameras in phones, and now our privacy is being invaded. And a few years later, everybody had cameras and phones, so it wasn't really as much of a big deal. Now we have social etiquette around it. If we had a phone that came out that had a smartphone in it and all these other features, it would probably fail if that had been released 20 years ago, all of those features at once. And so we saw that this example of Google Glass actually failed because it was this idea of an enhancing technology. It enhanced above the norm of what we were used to. Yeah, a photo shoot out there. So the issue with this, anything above the enhancing line is scary. Anything that's normal becomes invisible. We now don't do a second look unless there is, unless there's some Google Glass there. If it's a smartphone, it's not really a big deal. And then there's the idea of restorative technology, which can look totally weird, but is acceptable, right? A lot of us have glasses, and it's not really a big deal, right? But it's weird looking. Right? Or like somebody with crutches. Like crutches look kind of strange, but we're used to it because it's restoring humans to the norm. Therefore, it's not fear-inducing. So if we look at feature phones, when they came out, there weren't that many features, there were few apps. They were widely adopted over time because they were just a step in the evolution of the landline telephone. It's the landline telephone unleashed. Suddenly there's no cord in the way, and everybody can walk around with them in their pockets. And then the smartphone camera came out, and people freaked out temporarily, and now people are used to it. Google Glass came out with all of the features at once, $1,500 price tag, only a few people can buy it, and you have to be a developer too. Right? So of course this was terrifyingly fear-inducing. Instead of being, here's a little headband that you wear in your car that gives you some driving directions, here's all the things. So what happened was nobody had developed anything, no one was able to play, it was a closed system, there were so many features that no one knew what was going on with it, and then the price was this big issue. So nobody played, people were confused, people started speculating that it was recording you all the time, when in reality that wasn't its primary function. In reality, there wasn't even any primary function. There was no focus, right? So I got this kind of pie graph together of questions people ask me when I wear Google Glass, which is mostly, are you recording me right now? Because there was no indicator, there was no status light that told you that it was recording you, because they left out that piece of Calm technology, that Calm alert, that when you turn on something to record somebody, there's a light. Usually there's a light. They didn't even put that into it. But let's look at the iPhone launch. Instead, it was just improving an existing system. They allowed developers in at $99 to build whatever the heck they wanted within a limited set of features. You know, you get 5 or 6 sensors, and that was it. So the results were that people were making whoopee cushion apps, and they were making little button press apps that like play the sound of a horse. They were making these silly things. And by the time the phone came out, those applications were the marketing strategies for the app. Like, they didn't really need to have too many advertisements. All they had to do is show what people did on the phone, show how people played with the phone. And so of course there was widespread adoption because it was just a stepping stone. And then the next year they came out with more features, and they had the supply chain work with those features. There are a lot of companies out here in general that don't understand this. And it's not necessarily that the whole company doesn't understand it. It's usually that like a few people at the top that make decisions keep putting in more features, not understanding that the real world has a metabolism rate. Like, it takes a while for any new feature to be absorbed into the general public, and you have to be slow. And you can remember the story about the elevator. When the elevator first came out, people complained that it was too fast and it was hurting their eardrums. So they had to artificially slow down the elevator. Not because technology wasn't ready for us, it was that we weren't ready for the technology. So with that said, I really think that the right amount of tech is the minimum necessary to solve the problem. It's really hard to use the minimum amount of technology to get something done. And that doesn't mean that it has to be electronic. It can be completely analog and you're still solving the problem. The problem is it's hard to get buy-off from that, especially when people have big budgets that they need to fulfill. This example, it's on all the airplanes, is this toilet occupied sign. It has a red-green color. Even if you're red-green blind, though, there's a redundant system that tells you whether the toilet's occupied or not. It's a symbol. You can see it even if your glasses are off and you're tired in the middle of an international flight. And it uses good peripheral attention awareness. You can understand whether the toilet's occupied or not. And you don't need to translate into 30 different languages because it doesn't use any text. So this is a really boring example, but this is the type of stuff that works really well and becomes widespread. Technology should be making use of the near and the far. And what I mean by that is there's this kind of cycle of mainframes where things were far away, where we stored data far away from ourselves. And then desktops, everything was very close. We stored everything on a hard drive, right? And we never thought of like storing it in the cloud. And now we're like, oh man, I can't store anything on a hard drive. Maybe the hard drive will fail. I'll put it in Dropbox, right? Now we're storing information away from us. The problem is when we have all this smart technology in our home, we don't want to press a light switch and then have the signal go to the internet and then have it come back and turn on a light. We need to be making use of the processing power on our devices, which is much more than the desktop computers we had before. And a lot of people are relying too heavily on the far and making things that are really bandwidth heavy instead of using the processing power on their devices. So yeah, we have this new transition, and we have these little computers in the palm of our hand that are really small and they can do a lot. Yet we keep going to this other space that we don't necessarily need to. This is a very long slide of all the principles, which is impossible to read, so I'm going to skip it. So in summary, good design allows people to simply accomplish their goals, what they need to do, what they need to get out of something, whether that's just like turning on their television and watching a streaming movie, in the least amount of moves, right? So you're taking steps away until there's no steps left to take away. And then Calm Technology does that one step further, where it says the most valuable resource we can have is attention. And so it allows us to do those same goals with the least amount of mental cost, because that's the really restricted resource that we're having in the future. So in conclusion, a person's primary task is always going to be being human and not being on a computer all the time, because we are humans and that's what we should be doing. We're the ones that can't be automated, because whenever you can create things, you can't automate that with a computer. You can always use a computer as a tool to help you out, to get you more information. But how you synthesize that information as a human is something you can't replicate. And so you need to be able to grab people's attention that's on all these scattered devices and start to give that back to people by designing better systems and technologies. This is the original quote from Mark Weiser about the scarce resource in the 21st century is not going to be technology. We're going to be swimming in it, but it's going to be our attention that we're not swimming in anymore. So thank you very much. Could everyone hear me that entire time? Oh, that's great. I'm so relieved. So that was like 24 minutes. It's relatively short. So I have plenty of time if you want to pummel me with questions about pretty much anything.
I just want to make a statement. That you're the first person that brought up the concept that I've ever heard talk about the concept of making technology do the bare minimum it needs to accomplish something, instead of giving you all of these tools and all of these ways to do things. Because my biggest problem with computers and phones and everything has always been the learning curve, and by the time you're familiar with something, it changes again, and it's so hampering, which is hilarious because it's like too many tools. So I don't know, I guess that's just a statement, but it was really interesting.
Thank you. That reminds me of when people were designing for desktop applications. Like, look at Adobe Photoshop, right? If you need to do something simple, you can use Photoshop Elements, right? But if you want to use it as a power tool, yeah, it's really complicated to use. But think about the learning curve behind like a lathe or something like that. There's a significant learning curve to a power tool. The issue is that once you learn that power tool, it's your brain understands all those pathways in virtual space, right? So when it was designed for desktop, you would have a release every 2 years. The new version of Photoshop, and like 6 months before, here's the new features. Here's where they're going to move all the icons, right? Now we have Creative Cloud, right? Where anything can download at any time, and you can always have these updates where, oops, we forgot to include this feature. Oops, we didn't really finish that thing. Now you have to download it. Oh, we changed this interface around, right? So instead of this solid thing of, okay, I can deal with these weird bugs for 2 years and maybe there's a patch released by a third-party developer, I have to stick with this weird, bloated, tingly system that is akin to living in an apartment complex where sometimes you come home and your door is in a different place. And maybe your cabinets are misaligned, and there's no cups anymore. Where'd the cups go? Hey, where are the cups? You are 2,343 in line. Please wait for the cups. Oh, we decided to deprecate cups because the guy that wrote the cup software, he left the company 3 years ago. So I think about that all the time. Like, people are like, oh, desktops, da da da. It's like, desktops were a utopian environment for developers. You can work at a large company, have a relatively stable job, deal with this much bureaucracy that you can understand, and release something every 2 years, and it better be a good release, because that thing is going out on a CD-ROM, and you can't edit a CD-ROM. And we have a warehouse full of them. You can't make a mistake.
Well, I feel like, too, like, it's like maybe kind of indicative of, like, this is the first time in human history where the technology development curve has outdone the learning curve for anything. So, like, you know, before you learn lathe or like learn how to build something or do something or work with something in any field, but now by the time you learn it, they've reformatted it or they've come up with a better way. So it's, I don't know.
Yeah, there aren't as many people paying attention to quality, right? Like, like a good developer's crafting a piece of code and taking away all the excess stuff, so it's very elegant, right? And in the past, where people had to program systems that if they crashed, people would die, like an airplane system, airplane reservation system, airplane control system, and they were writing in COBOL or assembly, or they were writing for early versions of Nintendo software where you had 8 bits to do something in. People had these limitations. They had to figure out what's all the functionality that we can put into the smallest space possible. You can read these blogs about people like, well, we only had like 32K, so we made these clouds do this thing in the background, and it repeated this code, this code, this code, and this code, and we thought we were very clever, right? And they were, right? The problem is that we keep having more and more resources in our software and operating systems, and there is no incentive to be clever because we don't have the limitations. There aren't as many budget limitations because people are getting paid so much. There aren't as many limitations to like the features that you can have. So you end up having code that does everything, and in doing so does nothing, So it makes me really upset. So every once in a while you get these amazing breakout developers that make something really simple. Right? Or they make something where maybe their code wasn't very good to begin with, like Matt Mullenweg in 2003 with WordPress, which now runs 23% of the web. He made WordPress after going to South by Southwest saying, oh, blogs are interesting, I'm going to make my own blogging framework. But the thing about WordPress is that eventually he figured out that you can make it modular so people can write other plugins and be better at writing code than you, and you can just feature them on a website. So people could say, I have a limit, then fine, let's bring something else in.
Kind of working my way towards your question, thinking about the connections between what you're saying about technology in the sense of code and programming and technology in the sense of hands-on tools. And coming at this from the perspective of somebody who's interested in youth and maker spaces and facilitating that kind of engagement with being able to make things that some of the things might be physical, some of the things might be code, and sort of ways to encourage the kind of thinking that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so the question is about things that are physical, things that are virtual, how to encourage kids to engage, and the idea of tools. So I was just watching a bunch of people play Minecraft recently. I like to go to sleep at night, sometimes watch people do walkthroughs of some crazy world someone set up in Minecraft. It's this adventure, and everybody's walking through looking like that kid going like this. You're a good dancer, you should keep doing it. No, he's very embarrassed. It's okay, I'm embarrassed too. So anyway, but Minecraft is great because you see kids creating like entire logic games and entire puzzle games and triggers. And basically they're doing rudimentary programming in a space where they have infinite room to do rudimentary programming, right? Like if you watch somebody make a MIDI player in Minecraft, you have a square mile by square mile virtual field where you like light a thing on fire and then it plays the like music blocks like these tones as each thing explodes, right? And then you have a MIDI file that's made from scratch that's 1,000 feet long, right? And that's like a really short tune. People are making these. They're making minecart games where you can set switches. They're like, oh no, the minecart stopped at the end. I need to make a track that like switches it over here so it comes back to the beginning. How do I do that? So you have these kids that are thinking all night about how they're going to do that. When they get to the computer next, they're trying this out or this out. It works, it doesn't. They look up a tutorial online. It's always this incremental growth, right? It's never, I'm going to make a Ruby blogging system so that I can get a job at Google, right? Because a lot of people are approaching programming that way. They're like, well, I'm going to do this so I can get a job. And this other person's like, oh, I only get 2 hours of computer time a day. What can I do the next time I get on that computer, right? So much programming is done in your brain trying to figure out the next incremental step of the thing that you want to do, because suddenly you have more control over the thing in front of you on a desktop than you have in your entire life. Like maybe kids make fun of you at school, but in this world, you can do anything you want, right? It's super empowering. So I actually did this survey, and I don't even know what to do with all the data. It was, how do you learn how to program? Because all these kids came up to me and all these adults, and they said, how do I learn how to program? Do I go to college? And I say, by the time you go to college, like it's not necessarily too late, but it's something that you just accidentally end up doing, Oh, it's always like, what if I could change this thing? ooh, what would happen if I changed that? And then you model it through in your brain, right? So I did this survey which got 1,000 responses and Slashdotted, and people filled out this like 45-minute form. And everybody, they were self-taught. You know, it was always editing something. So Minecraft is a space that's unfinished that allows you to edit things. A lot of operating systems now are fully finished, right? So it's really hard to edit something and make something. It's relatively easy for like a 14-year-old to download Xcode and make something because there's a lot of tutorials online, but you still have to set up this crazy programming environment to do it. For instance, if you're in Australia, like there are limits to how much you can download often. So 4.5 gigs is like most of people's limits there, and that's how much Xcode takes to download. There's other things that people can do, but usually it's, you know, early with Apple II, it was easy to just sit a kid down in front of a computer and they would mess with something, you know, but now it's, oh, well, I got distracted on Facebook. So my concern is that a lot of people, maybe they're learning some high-level code, but they're not learning the original HTML and CSS because getting a domain and like setting that all up is really hard. So there are some sites out there, like there's a site called neocities.org, which is a remake of GeoCities. And you can actually go in and it's just static HTML and CSS. And the idea is that there's a limitation. What can you do with this limitation? The minute you impose a limitation, then you get that cleverness, right? And that's why it's really fun, you know, to play in that environment. We don't have playgrounds right now because everything is so serious. It's everything needs to look this way and be done with these standards, right? Versus use HTML and CSS, here's some documentation, have a great time, right? And then 5 years later, they're a professional web developer, right? And I mean, when I played around with the web, I never thought I could get paid for it. I was just messing with it, right? I didn't know what it was. I was just like, oh, I need to run a forum system. Oh, I got attacked by like some kid in Russia. Okay, well, we're the same age, it turns out, so we're just gonna battle for a while, right? Oh, system administration, I can get a job in this now? Cool, right? So it's this accidental thing, and it's gotta be fun. You know, if they're thinking about a job in the end, it's not going to be fun, you know, so. Arthur?
Yeah. What do you see as interesting uses of Internet of Things? Like, kind of like forecasting what could be done with.
What could be done with the Internet of Things? What can't be done with the Internet of Things? In all seriousness, I like the idea of having, like, using the sensors on people's phones to detect things, right? So to do like wind detection, noise detection, pollution detection, radiation detection, so that you can actually understand a city more. So there are maps and lots of data sets out there that aren't really in the same place about like, this has the most accidents at this intersection. You know, and if you could say, okay, now let's talk to the land planning department and say, hey, let's edit out this intersection and change it. Or like, let's install a stop sign here because people are slamming on their brakes faster because our accelerometer data with our bike tracking app that people use show them slamming into the stop sign at this stop or at this intersection because there's no stop sign and it's a blind corner and they didn't know cars were coming, right? So it's about making that invisible data visible so that you can look at it and say, oh, let's change this. Like a lot of it is about taking that, maybe call it little brother instead of big brother or like big mother or something like that. Anyway, the idea of having somebody outside of you, which is also you, be in this kind of positive loop that says, oh, I can suddenly see my behavior over time, or suddenly I can see a city over time. What can I do with that data? How can I improve on these systems, right? We have a lot of stretchy suburbs right now that, you know, they could be designed better, right? There's a lot of car culture that isn't necessarily bad or good. It's just, it is really expensive to maintain. So how can we like implement different city designs, right? This is all longer term stuff, but you need to have the data so you can model an improvement. So I kind of see it as that. It's more like feedback loops. Like cybernetic feedback loops and cybernetics were in the 1940s, and we haven't really talked about them again. And it's not about a government being like, here's our cybernetic feedback loop, and now we're controlling everybody. It's more about citizens saying, we understand where the potholes are, and now we're going to do something really rude to improve. If anybody's seen that article, there's... But it's about people taking that data into their own hands and then proving that something should be done or not, right? because everybody's a sensor, right? So if you can use that, then you can improve things. Ideally, I like to take a utopian view, hopefully. Not the proprietary Internet of Things where your fridge doesn't talk to anything else and then blocks you from doing something.
First off, thanks for giving the talk. Definitely love kind of the idea of design is basically not finished until there's nothing to take away. Have you seen or heard David Eagleman's talk in Vancouver 10?
No, I haven't.
It's so basically it's on sensor inputs to the body. I think he approaches it a little more from the medical side, but it's basically exactly this: how can an astronaut run a spaceship when there's a million things for a million different inputs, different controls? And so it's essentially finding ways to input information into the brain through senses we already know, touch, smell, and things like that. And it just kind of goes on how it's really impressive how the brain just takes in information and makes sense of it. He has a vibrating backpack, and when it vibrates in these certain ways, he knows that this is happening. And you don't have to tell somebody that's how it works. The brain just figures it out. So it's definitely something I recommend.
Cool. I'm taking notes on that, by the way. Not tweeting. This guy at the back of the room is... All right. Thanks. Thank you for that. I'll check that out. You had your hand up before, right?
Yeah.
Okay, you
Kind of
first.
piggybacking, and this is all kind of related, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts about that kind of reporting info, but of yourself, like your shopping preferences and little details, and how you would make it calm and not creepy, and reconcile fears of like privacy and security.
So the question is about that personal data, like shopping data and shopping preferences, and making sure that that's calm and not creepy. There's two solutions for that I've thought of and encountered. One is the idea of personal data file. You run your own personal server, or you have your own personal data store that has all that information, and you temporarily allow each site to use that piece of information for a time-limited period of time, right? So I'm going to allow this shopping site to use my data for this amount of time for this purpose. So you're the one in the center, and you're allowing these things to use your data, right? So now you are the resource that they're using, so they kind of pay for that privilege, right? So it's a series of microtransactions. So anytime you get into these really complicated models, I always like to flip the model around and say, okay, well, something has gotten really complex, let's just flip it, and suddenly it's really simple, right? Because right now we have all this redundant information. I'm going to tell each and every different site on the web, every single time I want to order something online, here's my information, right? When in reality, my information should be stored with me, and when I change it, it propagates everywhere, only when I need to use that technology, right? Only when I need to use that site. And so then, that might help a little bit, right? Because you're more in control. That's hard to do because a lot of startups are like, we're your personal data store. Okay, you're still a third-party solution, right? The data store should live on your phone or live on your computer, live somewhere, right? That's with you, right? But that's something that we probably won't see in this generation of the web because we're still in the cloud space and we're not in the cloud has rained our data back onto us and now we have it on our devices. So we're waiting for this thing, right? And I'm waiting for this curve. I think that if there is a tech bubble and it kind of comes down a little bit, we'll get the restrictions again that will allow us to innovate and be creative. But right now, there's a lot of the same stuff going on because there's a lot of funding, and people are just propagating the same model instead of creating a new one because it's cheaper. It's not cheaper. It's easier to get a job doing that, right? So a lot of the very creative people are getting paid a lot and waiting for this thing to happen, right? So I think of it like a tide going in and out. It's very good for things to happen, but it's kind of jolting and weird when it does. So the other thing is, let's see. So your question was about how to make it not as creepy. I mean, that's one of the ways I've been thinking about it. I guess, I mean, okay, maybe it's the only way I've been thinking about it right now. And if anybody has better ways, please let me know. Because I hate redundantly entering all this information in. Also, if you have your own health data file, you can share that with healthcare providers who look at your file for 15 minutes and then make decisions about the entire future of your life. That's not really a good time sample, but you are the one that's interested in that. At the Quantified Self conference a few years ago, which is a bunch of people who do self-tracking of data, I saw people come in and say, I have this really weird condition. and the doctors won't recognize it because it hasn't been listed yet. So we made a forum, and the forum has all these people that have the same symptoms. We figured out how to manage it and fix it, right? Because it's people that have the thing that care about it versus people who are paid to care about it who only have access to a data file that they got a degree for, right? Here is our database. It's closed. It doesn't have information in it that's new because it hasn't gone through a qualified system. Therefore, we can't do anything with it versus a more nebulous, strange community that's just information, right? So I think we're seeing this big shift between, on the one hand, we have the industrial society where you work a 9-to-5 job and everything's predictable. You go to a school so that you can do the same type of thing again and again. You need that stability and structure for supply chains to deliver things on time. But then you have the information society, which is you're getting random information from a place and you need to be able to understand how it works. And maybe something will come in that's not 9 to 5 Monday through Friday. Maybe some unexpected result might happen on Sunday. How do you deal with that? Well, if you have a community based on people that are on forums, you have people 24/7 that care about a certain thing, right? So that's one way to get that information into a system and have people discuss it. And now that doesn't mean that you're not going to have a community that has people freaking out about things that aren't real, because you can have that, right? But you also are more likely to have people dedicated working on this thing, 16 hours a day. There's a documentary about this. This woman had a kid that aged prematurely, and she actually started doing all these clinicals and trials and tests for a new drug with a whole community of people she found online and helped save a number of the kids' lives or extend their life. It's really neat. The whole time the paper was getting rejected because it wasn't done with like this many proper methods or this many proper things, yet the community was really tight. And one of the reasons is because there aren't that many people with that syndrome. Maybe there's like 30 that she could find. And so with that small of sample size, you don't have enough reliability to go through the scientific paper process. So that's the type of edge cases and weird things that come up that are really hard to solve with traditional medicine and industrial society type methods. So you have to go through this transition to the information society when things are a little bit weirder to kind of solve those problems. It's a really long-winded answer. Thanks for asking the question.
I'm curious about kind of both what you're talking about there, where there's like the establishment or the way things have been done historically, kind of coming up short against this resource for progress, and also what you were saying about like these big decision makers and big companies kind of preventing this simple progress that would be so refreshing and awesome for the end user. And it sounds like in both of those cases there's like a gap between this potential and the powers that be that I see all the time when you're like trying to use something and you're like, who decided this? This is so stupid. Yeah. So like how does that fix itself? Is time the only way that gets surmounted, or is there a way to jumpstart that process?
So that's a really good question. The question's about there's this big gap between decision makers that do something and the people that actually make the innovation. And sometimes the decision makers make the innovation, but it's rare, right? And sometimes they get in the way. So what I've been thinking about is that if you apply the same lens of industrial society versus information society, industrial society says you're an executive, you have a plan, an idea for a product, you have a roadmap, you have buy-off, and then by the time you get down to the developers, you're just telling them what to develop. And the developers are saying, actually, we can't do this. This happened with the Challenger explosion when Richard Feynman investigated. He was like, the engineers said that we can't have this type of O-ring in here because if we do, and the conditions are a different temperature, it will fracture and then the thing will explode, right? But by the time it got all the way up to the top, they said, oh, well, it's not really a big deal, right? And they had, they were afraid to, there was this whole investigation, right? So you kind of have that situation. And I guess you have this again and again, right? Or we shouldn't really put this feature in, or that feature's impossible, right? We were developing something with my old startup where we were doing something that was impossible, yet the guys were like, well, we'll give you a lot of money for it. I was like, we can't do it, but the executives were like, it's totally possible. No, it's not possible. We can't do this. It's not physically possible. This is off-the-shelf consumer hardware. We're trying to make it act like non-consumer hardware, and your experience is different, right? But we still made it. Right? And it didn't work, right? And some of it still doesn't work, right? So then you write some documentation on it, sometimes doesn't work, right? You fix it, right? By marketing. So I think, again, it's that industrial versus information society. A lot of people who are just developers, who are a team of like a developer and a designer, they're making amazing things. Like Matt Mullenweg made WordPress, right? He's a developer. He didn't have to get buy-off from a giant community. He got the community to actually, use his software. So I think we'll just keep seeing these random bursts of cool things that happen that people use behind the scenes, and then we'll see big companies try to copy it with a really big budget. I think like the smallest budget people have is really great and the smallest team possible. I see people raise $3 million and they have a team of 16 people. You don't need 16 people. You need like 3 really good people, And then as you grow, you may need like 16 people for support if you did it really poorly, right? So I was trying to redesign the system once, and I was like, well, can I just call up the support department and ask them what their biggest problems are? They're like, no, we want to redesign the whole thing. Well, then we'll have the same problems we had with the old system, a set of new problems, and then we'll have to retrain support, and then there'll be stuff that's completely not solved, right? And so, and now people are doing this, but it takes a really long time after somebody's done it 16 times for a successful product, like this guy named Brad Frost, and then he gives these talks at like big conferences and says, just call the tech support department and solve 1 or 2 of the biggest problems. And everyone's like, okay, right? So I think time might fix it, but again, in every industry, there's just kind of some crap that just follows and says, hey, if we make it look like this, it'll work like this, right? And looks and how it works doesn't line up. Craigslist is very successful at being useful. It doesn't look nice, but it works on every single browser out there, right? Everybody can use it, You had a question. So I'll take.
You said earlier that the real world has a metabolism rate, and we're able to invent. I like to say that humans have 20/20 hindsight. We invent things faster than we're able to understand their utility or lack of utility, for that matter. And I guess I'm curious if it's just part of the human condition. Are we just going to keep making stuff that is it the innate in humanity to make it because we can? We can barely. Well, I remember being at my doctor, and he had said that I'm seeing more and more instances of people coming to me with traumatic brain injuries, injured while walking. They're looking at their fucking phones, right? And they trip.
So in answer to your question, which is a good question, do you think we'll just keep making the same tons of stuff because we can? Yes, of course, we're humans, right? The whole thing that keeps us going is that we make tools, and the tools abstract us from nature, which may or may not be good, but we make them out of nature, and then we go back and say, oh no, we don't have enough nature. Now we'll put a nature preserve over here where it's like edited nature. It's ridiculous. I think there'll just always be a spectrum, right? There'll be some people who make really incredible tools. There'll be a bunch of people who copy the people who make the incredible tools. There'll be people who mess around and make horrible tools, yet make lots of money off of them because they're good at promoting them. And it's just always going to be the spectrum. I think that's just how it works. I think, though, it gets dangerous or miserable when you have a situation in which right now there's a lot of funding, and so people are making the same types of things, and you don't have the people making as innovative stuff in some fields, right? Whereas if you look at what happened, let's look at Jim Henson, for instance. He got a degree in home economics, right, in college, right? And he made all of these crazy characters, and then there was Sesame Street. Where's that? Where's somebody taking something from one subject and doing something completely different with it in another subject, right? A lot of the progress that we've had is not somebody being excellent in computer science. It's been either like Steve Wozniak being like, I'm too poor to afford a computer. Let me see if I can make one. Let me see what's the minimum amount of parts that's the cheapest cost to make something, and then that became the Apple computer, right? So he's just thinking there all night, how can I afford my own computer? Or somebody who's an anthropologist that comes into a company, and says, why don't you put the big green button on the printer? Because people don't want all those tons of buttons to say what something needs to be, right? Or, Steve Jobs taking calligraphy classes at Reed College and then saying, oh, neat, you could do that on a computer. Or the guy who invented Adobe Systems, whose dad was in the printing industry, and he figured out how to make modern publishing on the web, right? So it's always these different fields that influence another field, right? And yet we keep teaching people these like, here's your narrow subject, don't go outside the subject, right? It's the Industrial Revolution type thing. You can be really good at this thing. But the minute you try to like go across this, oh no, but some people do anyway, right? And then they make these really interesting things. Sometimes it completely fails. So who was next? I think you were next, and then you.
So I think in observing the past, there's the center where there's a high level of adoption and assurance and consistency, and then the really interesting things happen on the margin. And so I'm wondering about how you see that changing, or how is that operating now, because the margin has become so central and accepted. And maybe calm technology is what's going on in the margin because it's counter to what's going on in the center. That's one thing, but also in talking about, like, for instance, when you were engaged to do something that's impossible, or somebody runs something poorly to hire 16 people, there's a huge amount of learning that's going on in that failure. And it has its place, because if you think about just removing that and making everything run smoothly, where would we be?
So these are two really good questions, which I'll rephrase. One is about there is the kind of norm, and then there are these margins, and all the weird fringy stuff that becomes the center happens in these margins, right? So what's happening right now is there's all this stuff in the center, and this thing that was originally on the fridge is in the center, and now what's on the edges, right? And so the question is calm technology on the edge because it's just this weird thing on the fringe right now? And I would argue, yeah, it's a kind of boring idea. It's calm, it doesn't draw a lot of attention to itself. It's usually this opposite thing that retaliates against the norm, which is there are too many features, right? So the next step is the opposite, the least amount of features, right? And then the other question is about when you're hired at a company to do something that's impossible, that even if you do that and it doesn't work, there's this amazing learning experience you can get from it. The problem that I've seen is that oftentimes people take a year or two or three to make something perfect before they release it, instead of saying, let's fail a lot of times and learn from it and be okay with it, because there's this tremendous pressure to say, we have decided that this will be perfect in this PowerPoint, and we have presented this and gotten buy-off, and it's perfect right now. Right? And a lot of people do that.
And it's PowerPoint.
It's PowerPoint, right? Which works. But the idea behind it is that oftentimes, like, a really, really good team of people will be playing around with stuff. It doesn't matter if the thing fails or not. If you criticize something, like a lot of people at like a larger corporation, if it's their idea, it's now a representation of them. So if you poke holes in it, because it's interesting to poke holes in things, they take it personally as an extension of themselves, versus saying, oh, well, let's move on, right? So you get these people in these situations where maybe their idea wasn't good, and if their idea wasn't good, they get moved into another division of the company that doesn't do anything anymore, right? So there are tremendous risks the more money and success a company has to do something unique and original and fail. And so you end up having these innovation centers that are set up that kind of try to allow people to fail, but it's really hard to do. So it's really important in these small groups where it doesn't matter if people fail or not, to fail as quickly as possible and create something, because the whole time you're just training, right? Like if you put a bunch of kids out on a playground and they've never seen like, a pull-up bar before, 3 months later, they're going to be doing all sorts of tricks on it, right? Because they've all trained together, figuring out what's possible and what's not. And you don't have the same thing in companies because they're not acting like kids, they're just acting like, oh, this is the world. And if it fails, then this guy loses his job, So I think that's one of the problems that larger companies with a lot of money have, and smaller groups don't have as much of that. Although I've seen a lot of startups that try to act like a big company really early, and they end up failing really fast. And the more money they raise, the faster they tend to spend it. That's a good question. I'm going to be thinking more about that. There's another question.
I have a question. It's kind of similar to the question before. I guess I was thinking about the example you gave of the weather that you can tell by the light, and I was just kind of thinking, like, how much, like, is there always going to be more little things that are periphery things, but that they fill the void, like trying to open up time for being a human? But if I didn't have that little light telling me that it's going to be rainy, then I probably wouldn't go and look at that it's that little thing that is actually taking your attention and making you go to, like, now I need to know the weather when I didn't think I needed to know it before.
That's a really good question. So the question is about, hey, if everybody adopts calm technology, then you walk into your house and there's lots of little tiny, a sea of tiny lights. They're all different colors telling you all these things. Just like a cockpit dashboard, right? And arguably you don't need to know all of those things, right? And I really hope it doesn't look like that. Like, I hope people aren't like, oh, you made a new book called Calm Technology. I'm going to put this into my organization. We're going to design everything with lights and buzzes, and suddenly, but yeah, I see the concern, because if you have something on your phone that says 10 unread things, you have to click on it, right? Like, people have that completionist thing. I have to get rid of those lights, right? But you can use that to people's advantage. If you had a toothbrush that turned like red, and then, you're like, oh, I have to deal with that light, and if I brush my teeth, the light will turn off. Then you use the idea of annoying people. Then you're dismissing the toothbrush by brushing your teeth for 3 minutes, right? Which I kind of like the idea of. But if you've got everything that changes color and buzzes at you, then it becomes just like pop-up windows on a computer. They become worthless. So the really important thing is to not design that many things that pop up, and the problem is that it's really easy to live a messy life with a bunch of junk, right? Because we have an excess of junk and an excess of supply chains that bring us really weird stuff from other countries. That's poor quality, and so we end up spending more money on these poor quality things, and we don't really curate our life, and that makes money. So I don't know how to respond to that, except the fact that more and more people are learning about how to curate their own lives and not have all these things be in their way, so that they can think more clearly. Like, I like to think of the brain as an operating system that has a limited amount of memory, right? A limited amount of random access memory. You walk into a messy house and every single little thing is taking up a piece of your random access memory, and then the system that says think about this higher level thing only has 20% of the memory, so you can't think about it, right? It keeps canceling out your higher level processes. So part of it is saying no to random technology that you don't really need. Like, don't click on the thing on Kickstarter that hasn't been made and won't be made for 3 years, just because it looks really cool at the moment. There's that kind of delayed gratification that people aren't used to as much. Like, you see kids using technology when they're younger, and they're on an iPad and they freak out if you take it away, right? Because everything is there. Versus building something slowly over time and getting good at it. A lot of people get freaked out. They're like, I started playing the piano, I'm not immediately amazing. Right? Like, okay, it's going to take 7 or 8 years to get reasonable, So you don't see all the work behind something, you just consume the end object on the web. Some weird outlier plays the piano in the Mario theme and they're 5 years old and it's amazing, right? And you don't understand that behind the scenes it took a long time. Or Angry Birds was a company that spent 10 years developing random apps, right? And then they made this thing, right? It was incremental. I think it goes back to your question, which is about, you need to have this incremental system that allows you to fail so that you understand how something actually works, because you can't build something without the environment telling you whether it's going to work or not. So if you don't release and you try to make something perfect, you automatically fail. Because most people can't just make something perfect out of the box. It's crazy. I like the logarithmic approach where you just get 10 people to use it at your house over some beer, and then 100 people to use it who send you emails or call you on the phone. And then by the time you're at 1,000 or 10,000 or 1 million, you don't have those little rookie mistakes that you tried out 10 people in. But when you try to tell people that in a company, they're like, what? We just released to everybody and we'll hire a marketer. No. Just get 10 people together who are going to give you an honest feedback. So I try to look at this, of course it's hard to convince people of these things without more evidence about how it works, because people are terrified of it, right? It's unknown, it's weird. So you have to get people used to it. There are a lot of other companies that have done this thing this way, and it's okay. All the things that they admire out there, they all started weird, right? People are I want to be the next Bill Gates, so I'm going to dress up like this. Okay, well, you really need to go into the desert and listen to a bunch of metal right? And like drink, and like steal random heavy equipment in the middle of the night and be a prankster, and like run out of your house and sneak out the window of your parents' house to go use the supercomputer at the local college from 3 to 4 a.m. because that's the only time slice they allow you to use it at, right? Like, look all the way back, do the research, figure out how stuff really was made, and you find a lot of people making pranks and being silly, right? And so right now people are so serious. Like, it's really hard when so many people are serious, because stuff often doesn't get made that way. When you look at really great teams, they're just having fun, and then that becomes the next greatest code that they made. But they made it while they were having fun, and therefore there are way less errors because they were using it. So maybe one more question. I think you had the question, and then I'm at like 1 hour, so I'll take more questions afterwards individually.
So since we don't live in a world of personal data, what are your thoughts on privacy, and do you actually read the user agreements and closing down
The good old privacy question.
I didn't.
Okay, so the question was about if you don't own your data or you do own your data, how can you make things better with privacy, and do you actually read the privacy policies before you download something? I was the person that cut open the cereal box and read the sweepstakes information when I was little to see how I could game the system to get more prizes. So I love reading the privacy policies before I download something. But most people don't, and they don't have the time to. So I actually had the whole talk on privacy, which is about having a human readable version and a machine readable version, which is just like the really long legalese, and then this is what this means, this is what this means, here are 7 things, right? And then when you change it, you propose that to your community, right? And the best thing to do is at the point in which you're publishing some information, or the point in which the app is using some information of yours, to say what it is, who it's used by, for what purpose it's used by, how long will it be stored, right? Because you could say, well, we're going to share it with A&W Burgers or something like that, right? But the fact that you know is the certainty is what helps people out. The uncertainty is the thing that causes people to freak out. The other thing is that your privacy is violated every time you get a piece of junk mail. But people don't like open up their physical mailbox and say, oh no, my privacy is being violated, check out all this junk mail, right? That's not what people do. They say, oh, this is junk mail, right? But right now, because it's really new, yeah, your privacy is being violated by an advertiser to make money off of you, right? Is that bad or good? I don't know, right? Because the problem is right now, a lot of stuff runs on advertising. That's not really a business model. It's a business model when there's lots of money. But, there's a lot of business models that don't run on that, right? There's a lot of business models that run on like an exchange of money. Like, here is the thing that you get. I am worried a little bit about Facebook. There's a thing called the Trust Engineers on NPR, or one of the Radiolab podcasts, I think. And it was all about how there's all these social experiments going on. And then I read another paper that said, if people are depressed, they're more likely to buy things for more money, and they're more likely to sell their own things for less. So if you have people listing stuff on a service, and then they're buying stuff on a service, you're actually making more money on e-commerce if people are sad, right? So the problem is with that type of business model is that the incentive is to tweak the algorithm so that people are sadder when they're on it instead of happier, because that makes more money. So think about that for a little while, and don't talk to me about it for a while, because it'll make me really sad. So that's the last question I'll take. Thank you so much for being here and coming to this.
Thanks everyone for coming. We return May 19th with Scott Gelotley of Gamblin Colors with his artist palette. As artists, designers, and makers, we're always working within the confines of our materials. There's nothing more natural and enduring than an oil painting. For 600 years, oil colors have been the preeminent medium of visual expression, and within this time, the world has become increasingly more colorful. Scott Gelotley, product manager for Gamblin Artist Colors of Portland, Oregon, will discuss the nature of oil painting and the evolution of a painter's most important tool, color. A working artist himself, Scott will also share the aspects of colors that painters consider when selecting a palette to express their artistic vision. Should be good. Let's have another round of applause. And ask more questions.